is World Teachers Day, a global event launched by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, in 1994. My guest today is a forward-thinking teacher that spends a great deal of time preparing the next generation for the challenges of the new world and inspiring them to reach farther. His focus is disrupting traditional education models. He is dedicated to inspiring students to enter STEAM fields and rethink our world using space as a foundation. He wants to take education into the next era and off-planet. Please welcome Dr. Mark Wagner. Hi, Dr. Wagner. How are you doing today?
Oh, so good, Izzy. Thanks for having me on.
The first time I heard you speak, you were discussing Aries on Casual Space Podcast with Beth Mund. And I'd never met you before.
I remember the episode.
and I loved your idea of what education could be. Can you give us a little hint on what the Aries initiative was or is?
Yeah, and I think it's evolved a little bit since then. Well, Aries, which is the Academy for the Relentless Exploration of Space, is a school that sits at the intersection of three problems. And I should say it's a vision for a school. So we're working to get this off the ground, but it sits at the intersection of three problems. The first is, of course, schools today are in need of transformation, and we see that worse now than we ever have in the wake of COVID. We see chronic absenteeism among students. We see burnout among teachers. And speaking as an educational technologist, schools have just been in the churn for the last few years. And even though technology has made emergency distance learning possible, and a lot of that has stayed in place in the wake of COVID, they're also in a situation now where schools really are not yet ready to listen to anything innovative or new. They're all still just sort of recovering and dealing with the current reality. And of course, you go back decades or arguably centuries in our industrial age or medieval model of education, and that's ripe for change. And we've known that for 100 years when it comes to research on best practices. So that's one problem. The other is workforce development in the space industry. We're looking at an industry that's growing rapidly and changing rapidly, and it's not just the folks who are going to be scientists, engineers, and astronauts, and it's not just STEM education that we're concerned about, but in a situation similar to the internet or the mobile phone, the smartphone, if you will, we're seeing space now impacting and set to impact virtually every industry on Earth. And preparing kids for that reality is a far cry from what's happening in most schools today. So workforce development for the space industry, or you could call it more broadly the space economy, gets really, really interesting. And then the third thing, and this is how Aries has really evolved in an exciting way, is the massive untapped potential of teenage innovators and entrepreneurs. And looking at this now that we've got Aries in an accelerator, we're in the New Chip Accelerator right now, and we've sort of been peripherally involved with Silicon Valley adjacent initiatives for years. Looking with that lens at what's happening in education and the fact that you've got kids who have been proven to be more than capable at launching innovative, world-changing ideas, largely sitting and twiddling their thumbs at their desks. And you've got venture capitalists with money that they want to invest in new ideas and in world-changing, world-saving ideas, and in this growing space industry in particular. But they don't have any way to tap into that ingenuity that's just sitting in rows, turning in papers in schools around the world. So Aries is right at the intersection of those three things. It's a transformative model for a school, and frankly, it's pieces that we've seen work well in the best, most innovative schools around the world over the last 20 years. It's also a focus on workforce development for the growing space economy, while it's tapping into student innovations and entrepreneurship to launch meaningful, world-changing, lucrative companies and connecting them with venture capitalists. So it's really kind of an exciting model that we're putting into work at Aries and at the Moonshot Lab, and hopefully we can dive into more of that. But that was a long answer to your question.
Oh, it's one of my favorite models. So on that, and I hope that it can be quite successful, and we can start to duplicate it. So because schools,
Here we go.
it's not one size fits all, and each student needs something different.
And that's the beauty of this is we are also not trying to make every kid an astronaut or an aerospace engineer. I spent much of the last year talking to people like yourself from all across the industry who are space marketers and space interior designers and space historians and space lawyers, and kids can be tapping into those industries too.
Space is inspiring, period. I mean, it is one of the most inspiring things that we have. Let's use it to give kids the juice to get up in the morning and to make them excited about learning.
That's exactly right.
So you recently launched a book, which is available on Amazon, which, by the way, I have 2 copies. I have one ebook and I have a hard copy because I don't read ebooks the computer is used for something different for me. And
I read a lot
so
of
I have
my
a hard
Kindle.
copy.
I love the paper too, right?
And then and Audible coming soon, I hope. Anyway, it is titled Space Education, Preparing Students for Humanity's Multi-Planet Future. Go ahead and tell us what that book is about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had to keep the title short, but it's very, very similar to what Aries is about. It's very much preparing students for the growing space economy and humanity's rapidly approaching multi-planet future. The space economy is expected to be, just the sort of existing space industry is expected to be $1 trillion industry I think by 2040 is the projection. But if you look at new industries like space solar power, that's $1 trillion projected at the same time. If you look at asteroid mining, and the DART mission was just successful yesterday, we're looking at $1 trillion asteroid mining industry at that point in time too. And this is all in the next 15 years. And if you think about kids who are in school today, what they're going to see in those 15 years, and they're going to see us return to the moon, and they're going to see the first manned missions to Mars, and they're going to see probably 3 replacements for the International Space Station in the commercial arena, if not more. And they're going to see, all of these new launch providers and ubiquitous broadband internet provided by satellites that dictators can't block. And they're going to see, already Earth monitoring satellites changing all kinds of industry from agriculture to, architecture, you name it. Schools are not doing a good job preparing kids for that. So that's what the book is about. And it was written when I was doing, and this is amazing that these exist. I was doing a program for a graduate certificate in space education and a graduate certificate in space philosophy at Kepler Space Institute. And I at least sort of had all my ducks in a row and all the papers pointed in the same direction. And at the end of it, I realized that I had a book on my hands. So it talks about, why space education and why space, why that's important to people here on Earth. It talks about a vision for a new kind of school, which essentially is integrated into what we're doing with Aries right now. And it goes a couple of steps further because it also looks at, okay, if we're talking about having people on the moon and on Mars in the next decade, how are we going to educate them there when we have our first multi-generational settlements and people are truly migrating into the solar system? And that got really, really interesting when we started talking about things on Mars. There's certainly gravity and radiation and the same issues you'd have to deal with for any settlement. But when you start thinking about the unforeseen consequences of the communication delay, which could be up to 46 minutes round trip between the Earth and Mars, even the presumption that we could do distance learning the way we did in COVID doesn't work. That breaks when you've got that kind of, you got to type in a Google search and wait 46 minutes for the results, and then what happens every time you click on a result. So you can address some of that with caching and local resources, but you certainly can't rebuild the entire internet at Mars, at least not right away. So that gets interesting. The academic calendar gets interesting. It was fun to write about. And looking at very concrete plans on the moon was part of that second part of the book because that's more realistic. And then the last part of the book is more space philosophy. So ethics, governance, sustainability as we move out into the solar system and as we think about educating the next generation and future generations in the solar system. The primary pragmatic focus, though, is all of that stuff is relevant right now to kids in school right now. Like a kid starting kindergarten now is going to graduate when most of what I just said has already happened, at least according to today's plans. So what are we doing to prepare them for that? Is very much what the book is after and what the school is designed for.
Well, and to bring a point, we don't know really what's going to happen. We can kind of think about it, but there's going to be so many things that happen that we just don't see coming. For example, our conversation right now, the fact that my job did not exist when I was in school. In fact, my job didn't exist when I first went to college. So what jobs don't exist yet? And that $1 trillion industry, that's a conservative effort. We're going to see a lot of things that are going to come online that we just don't expect. And it is going to just change how we do things. And I'm excited for one, but we need to get kids prepared for that. So you obviously have a passion for STEM, and STEM is science, technology, engineering, math, and then there's STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and education. Can you tell us why you are so passionate about STEAM and education and about your journey to get where you are today?
Yeah, and I think I can answer that. It's definitely a two-part answer for me. On one hand, I feel like everybody needs to have a basic understanding of science, technology, engineering, and math, whether or not they're going to be scientists, engineers, and astronauts, right? We need a basic understanding of the world around us. Just as if, I don't know, hunter-gatherers needed to know what plants are poisonous or not. Right? We need to understand that, and it needs to be a basic part of our education. Add to that the need for workforce development and the fact that we need many more engineers than we have today, and we need people who can work with exotic materials and people who can design new ones. Right? That becomes really important for our future as society and for all of humanity. The sort of second answer is, of course, we don't expect all kids to be scientists, engineers, and astronauts, and that's where STEAM comes in, and that's only the tip of the iceberg, I think, if you're talking about the arts. We don't want to export the military-industrial complex, even if we do it peacefully. We don't want to just export the military-industrial complex to the moon and to Mars and elsewhere, and into orbit. We want to explore something much more representative of the whole of human society, and we're going to need writers, and we're going to need artists, and we're going to need singers, and we're going to so on, right? We're going to need people who make great movies, and people who innovate new art in zero G and on other planets. So that element is really, really important. But if you take it even a step further, if we're not expecting everyone to be astronauts or engineers or scientists, we also are going to need lawyers, historians, teachers. We're going to need marketing professionals. We're gonna need, and literally all of these jobs exist today through the SpacePrize speaker series. We could talk about too. I've interviewed space lawyers and space interior designers of luxury spacecraft and space fashion designers for weightlessness, and these are real jobs that real people are doing today. So you're right. We project that a decade or so. We don't only need to prepare kids for that. We need to prepare them for the things we haven't seen coming, which obviously you and I have seen in our day. And speaking from, you're talking about my path to get here. I'm a lifelong space enthusiast. I went to space camp a couple times as a kid. Originally, my undergrad was in astronautical engineering, but along the way, I was also in drama, and I was in a band in college and wrote music. And so in the early 90s, I jumped ship like a lot of my peers. It was not a terribly exciting or lucrative time to be in astronautical engineering. And I ended up deciding that I wanted to study science fiction. And science fiction is literature. And that led eventually to teaching literature in high school and a whole career in education technology and teacher professional development, which was a lot of fun and a whole nother conversation. But the idea that now, 20 years later, I can take my education career and my time as an entrepreneur in that field and bring it all to bear on space education and preparing kids for this future we're talking about is really, really fantastic. But I don't think I could have done that in the same way if I didn't have that balanced path with, being drama and being on stage and performing music and, teaching kids literature and helping teachers. All of that is very different than had I just been an astronautical engineer the whole way. There's a whole other life we can imagine, but I don't think I'd be doing what I'm doing today with space education and preparing, for society changing movements that are right in front of us, had I gone the purely technical route. So definitely, yes, I am passionate about STEAM. Everybody should take calculus, and I'm passionate about, literature and the arts as well. Everybody should have an anthropology class and a linguistics class and a psychology class and a philosophy class. It's we've got a lot of bases to cover.
In a perfect world, what would you like to see happen? What does the dream look like?
Yeah, I'm gonna make a common entertainment analogy here. We talk about a lot in the communities that you and I are in about wanting to bring about the Star Trek future rather than the Expanse, right? The both are great science fiction shows. The Expanse really relies a lot on the idea that we are exporting our conflicts and prejudices as we move into the solar system and beyond. And Star Trek at least begins with the premise that humanity is united and has higher goals and aspirations in mind at that point. Now, we still run into lots of aliens and there has to be conflict in the story. But what I have always liked about the Star Trek vision, and I got into the original series when I was in elementary school, before there was anything else. But the way I articulate it now is Star Trek is about diverse people working together using science and technology to solve problems and help each other, or help others. And I think that's a really great vision for the future. Occasionally I articulate it in such a way where it's like they're working together using science, technology, and sometimes spirituality to solve problems, which is true in the stories for sure, but I think it also needs to be true as we're relating to real people here on the earth. And that idea that we're wherever we are in the universe, we're working together in that way is inspiring to me. And so that is a underlying vision for the book, for the school, that we can prepare kids to do that. And that, going back to STEAM and STEM, and if you think about Star Trek characters, right, a Starfleet officer, they're not just scientists and engineers. They certainly all are. They're highly trained in science and technology. But they're also philosophers, and they have to make difficult ethical decisions all the time, and they are well versed in history and literature. And I really think, as much as there's a real movement around technical education and career education and trade schools and that sort of thing, and there's a real, I get it. I think we can aim higher in making sure that ordinary citizens are well read and in history and in philosophy and in literature, so that when they do have to make difficult ethical decisions, which we all do, they're going to be able to synthesize those things, and all of us will come out ahead.
And I think that Star Trek's both the new generation and the original, I think they celebrate what it means to be human and what it means to be something else. So they celebrate the being. and learn how to improve ourselves. I completely agree with that. What are some of the roadblocks and challenges that you see that need to be overcome in order to get this particular new enlightenment?
Well, this is familiar territory from two directions. One is, as an education technologist, I know well the immune system response of schools, right? If it doesn't fit into their way of doing things, it's going to be a significant amount of resistance. That said, COVID alone makes me realize how far we came in 20 years. The idea that most kids across the United States anyway could do emergency distance learning is pretty spectacular. Still left a lot of kids who didn't have the tech and didn't have the support at home on the side, and that's a problem. But we have made progress for sure. But I think, as an example, when computers came into schools in the 80s, there was a guy named Seymour Papert at MIT's Media Lab who wrote a lot about it. He's a guy that came up with that program Logo where you move the turtle around the screen. And, he thought computers were going to revolutionize education. But he imagined kids programming computers and doing exciting and new things with them and being creative. As it turns out, school had that sort of immune system response, and you can imagine little school white blood cells going and surrounding the computers and pulling them over to a computer lab and making a course out of it that you have to sit and read the textbook and do what the teacher said and get credit. And by 1993, Papert gave up, and he's like, "This school is not the place for computers because they're getting turned into school. They're getting turned into a class. Like, we need to still teach kids at home to program and do great things." So I've seen that over and over and over again. In 2006, the greatest thing in the world was getting kids blogging, like thinking about their learning and sharing online and interacting with others. And it's like, oh, well, that, IT departments and school lawyers were afraid about kids posting things online and blah, blah, blah. And now it's like, well, if there is a blog post, it's probably just shared with the teacher for a grade. So I'm simplifying things, but the idea is there's over and over and over again, there's these awesome tools put into school. Google for Education and Chromebooks were among them too, and now it's like they're all locked down, and it's kids are turning in their work on Google Classroom. So it's for a grade, right? These great open-ended tools over and over again get co-opted for the industrial age, sit in rows and do what you're told kind of education. And so we are and will continue to see that with space education. When we go into schools and we say, like, look at all this cool stuff you can do. If you ask kids, what problem do you want to solve? You've got all these resources to do it. School leaders that I talk to tend to think like, oh, that's great. But, the union would crucify me right now. We're still recovering from COVID. And my teachers would shoot me if I asked them to do one more thing. We'll say, well, that's because we're asking them to do too many things that aren't important. So we have to change a lot of that first. And it's a massive reskilling to get, a teacher who came up in a traditional school system and was probably successful in it, to get them to the point where they know how to manage a class that's doing something much more open-ended, project-based, entrepreneurship focused. That's a major professional development issue. So that's just kind of in schools. Outside of schools, from the other direction, also familiar. Last time we went to the moon was before I was born. And when I was a kid, I had a poster in my room that said we were going to be on Mars in 2014. It was like a NASA flowchart, so that obviously didn't happen. It's really, really hard to mobilize the public to care about these things, when we're still coming out of the global pandemic and people are worried about chronic absenteeism and teacher burnout, and they're worried about the economy, and they're worried about kids graduating, things like that. They don't really want to hear about space education. The irony, of course, is some of those kids that are maybe struggling or not coming to school might be excited and and be successful had they had something a little more meaningful to do. And looking to the future and creating the future is certainly meaningful. Never mind launching your own company to get it done, right? But in general, it's hard. NASA has a hard time articulating to people here like why space is important. It's hard enough to articulate the spin-off technologies, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And people don't understand all the benefits we already get from GPS and from Earth observation satellites. People on the street literally don't understand typically that it's thanks to satellites that they can get an Uber and they can get food delivered to their house, and you know what I'm saying, and that they can swipe left on somebody who's within 1.5 miles of them. Like, it's all of that is because of satellites, right down to our dating. And it's hard to articulate that to people, and people can kind of laugh. I mean, I'm sort of making a joke of it too. People, we don't need a lot of that, but we sure need orbital observation to track the environment and changes in the environment, and to combat that, and never mind legal and ethical issues around poaching or the military and that kind of thing. Like, all of that right now depends on, and will increasingly depend on, space technology. And education is going to be the same way. Already there are, and medicine's going to be the same way. Remote medicine, remote education in Africa, in places where they have equipment, is a huge deal. It's funny, I just dislodged a memory. I had a professor, an education technology professor in my PhD, probably in 2003-ish. And he had done his PhD years before with the Athabascan people in Alaska. And they'd set up an Apple II, I think it was in the 80s, set up an Apple II with a satellite link so that they could take MIT physics courses up on the tundra in their village, where they're literally killing reindeer for dinner. So, all of that is coming to fruition now in a much more, a much larger scale. And now you're talking about, the next Starlink generation being able to talk directly to these with no change in hardware. That's a big deal.
Well, and there is, the phones are space in your pocket. Mm-hmm. We are run by space in every aspect of our lives. And there is a huge disconnect between space and our lives. People don't realize it. There's just such a disconnect. And I hope that part of what we can do is just bring about the awareness of how much space is in our life, and how much, if we don't have space, it will affect our lives going forward with the climate. We need to be able to see it in order to change it. And the holes in the ozone are a great example of that. We saw them from space, and we were able to change legislation and now they're healing. They're getting smaller. So we need to do that and be aware of all those things. And in fact, the hurricane that's happening or by the time this is out, it'll already be over, I hope. But, it's moving very slow, so it may still be going on. But, we're able to see that coming. Back before the 60s, there was no way we could see that coming. It was little outposts on islands that, if they saw it, they could tell us about it. But there was thousands of people that would die because one day it'd be nice and sunny, the next day they'd be in the eye of a hurricane. So these things are very important. And one of the things I'd like to ask is how the audience can help bring about this new education model.
Boy, that's a great question. I certainly reach out to me if you're interested in talking about this, or interested in getting involved in any way. My hope will be, if we talk about areas in particular, we're in this accelerator right now, and so we anticipate getting venture funding in the next couple of months that we can use to launch the school next year, which would be amazing. And the plan then, of course, is to scale rapidly after that, which is good for everybody, including the investors. So if it's something you might want to bring to your town, we should definitely talk. One of the alternative models we're looking at is, we've often looked at this as an end run. We're going to have to do a proof of concept, but we're doing an end run around the public system, and eventually we want to come back and benefit students in public schools. So if this is something you want to implement in your school, your district, you'll definitely reach out, because all the pieces of it are things we've done before, and we could turn around and do them right now in a school district if the willpower was there. Other than that, I think having these, if we talk about those two problems we were just talking about, right? The resistance in schools, you got to break this cycle of, what you're going to wind up is the parent's going to go and ask the teacher, why are we doing all these lame worksheets to teaching to the test, right? And the teacher's going to say, well, the principal told me to do it. And the principal's going to say, well, the school district says it, and the district's going to be like, well, the board, and the board's going to be like, well, the state, and the state's going to be like, well, the voter. And it's like, well, guess what? No, that's the parent who doesn't want it, right? And like all the way around, they're just pointing the finger all the way around the whole thing. All you need is, wherever you are in that cycle, step out and just don't do it, and do something different. Do something like this. Ask kids what problem you want to solve and try to help them find the resources they need to do that, because that's where every kid has an answer to that question. I learned that back when we used to do senior projects, but now with the Moonshot Lab, it's even more powerful if you ask kids that and support them in launching, coming up with a solution. And we use design thinking and all that is probably another conversation, but supporting them and all that, what I think is huge, stepping out of that cycle. And if you think of the other problem we talked about in terms of the resistance the public has to space, if you're listening to this, you probably care, and we're probably preaching to the choir. Elizabeth Wallace in the Roundtable does a great job of this. She'll stop to get a coffee and just start talking to the person in line at coffee, and she's got all these great stories about these people that she meets, kind of in everyday life, sort of spreading the word about why space is important and why they should care that there's a DART mission hitting an asteroid, yesterday. It's really that's such a great example, because by and large people didn't care, but that is important because we now have the ability, theoretically, to protect the planet from an existential threat to humanity, and this is probably what will drive development. And now maybe we can move valuable asteroids closer so that we can mine them more easily, and that's a potential $1 trillion industry in the next decade. So those are two really big reasons to care. I talk about if you combine space solar power with lithium-rich asteroids for batteries, our energy problems are done. They're solved at a GDP changing level globally. Our energy problems could be solved within 10 years. So that communicating, what's that? Yeah, without pollution, exactly. Yeah. And communicating that sort of vision, communicating the reality of what's already happening, and all the benefits we're already carrying in our pocket, not to mention the wireless headphones and everything, spin-off technologies, but also communicating like why we should care and just how close we are. So I think everybody here can step out of that cycle, and everybody here can communicate that. Particularly teachers. Speaking of Teacher Day, like this, these are, boy, what a great place to help kids understand that if you're in that role. So I don't know if that was the sort of answer you imagined to that question, but I think given our discussion so far, maybe that was a good direction to take it.
Awesome discussion. And we're going to have to do the little commercial thing, because that's the world we live in. So hold on to your boosters. Well, yes, it is. So hold on to your boosters. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors and talk with one of Mark's inspirational programs taking off that has inspired young women in New York City. Marketing strategies related to our guest visit can be found on spacemarketingpodcast.com in the Show Notes Expanded section, with corresponding page numbers to the strategies in my book, Space Marketing, Competing in the New Space Economy, available on Amazon and Audible. Stay tuned, and we'll be right back. So, and we are back. I have the honor to work with you on one of your special projects that you have spearheaded. It is called SpacePrize. You want to tell us what that is?
Yeah, SpacePrize is fantastic. It's a nonprofit that I got involved with almost a year ago. It's been less than a year, though. And SpacePrize is focused on empowering young women to pursue STEAM education, which we've been talking a lot about today, and to explore careers in the growing space industry, which we've also been talking a lot about today. So there's a lot of synergy there. And the way they do it is two ways. One is through attention-grabbing contests with spectacular prizes, like zero-G flight. Then we sent 5 young women from New York City public schools on a zero-G flight in May that you were alluding to. And then the second way we do it is through open education resources. So the guest speaker series that I mentioned earlier, and also the space education curriculum that SpacePrize has put together that's free for any student, teacher, or enthusiast around the world. Over the past year, SpacePrize has run a SpacePrize challenge or contest in New York City and in Paris, and there's one underway right now in Portugal. And we have produced, I think it's about 16 episodes so far of the guest speaker series. We're booked out through next June, so that'll be over 50. And we've also produced this 8-chapter online flexbook in the curriculum, which is, we actually exported it as a PDF. It was 550 odd pages of content. So it's a legit textbook, but it's all linked to great stuff online from JPL and NASA and Lockheed, you name it, and it's lots of great videos and interactives and simulations. So I'm really excited about it, I'm really proud of it. And we just, we're still putting some finishing touches on it right now, but just released it, so super excited to have students and teachers able to use it now.
And speaking of teachers, teachers were instrumental in the SpacePrize actually coming to fruition.
Yes, absolutely. So the initial SpacePrize in New York, well, all of them we've had to partner with teachers in the schools, and it's been teachers who are passionate about this, taking it on. Most of our judges come from across the space industry, but we've also, of course, had teachers involved in reading the essays and that sort of thing. And teachers involved in the guest speaker series, and as part of the team writing the curriculum, we had practicing teachers, science teachers mostly, helping to write the SpacePrize curriculum. So, yeah, absolutely. There's so many great ways for teachers to be involved with SpacePrize. But most importantly, if you're teaching kids, show them the guest speaker series. Just spaceprize.org/speakers. You'll see all of the recordings of the people we've talked to, including astronauts, scientists, engineers, historians, designers, you name it. And check out the curriculum and see if that's something you can use. We have that now at spaceprize.org/education, and it'll redirect you over to CK12, which is another nonprofit that provides essentially open education resources for the entire K-12 curriculum to students and teachers around the world. So that's where our Flexbook lives, and hope you guys will check that out.
And as far as the contest itself, it began with an essay. Yes. And then it went to a video where these young ladies went through the process of developing these pieces of content to express how they felt about the overview effect. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the key was to give them an opportunity. Well, there was a number of important elements to those prompts. The first was to help it be approachable. We didn't want it to be something like, oh, what are your plans on being a rocket engineer? You know what I'm saying? Like, it had to be something that we wanted to be much more approachable to many more young women in high school when they may have already decided space is not for them. In fact, one of our winners told us later that she saw that and thought she didn't want to do that essay contest, but she's a self-professed English and social studies nerd, and her dad convinced her to do the essay contest at least, right? And when we asked about the overview effect, which is, of course, was coined by Frank White in the 80s, for anybody that doesn't know, 1987, and captured the idea that astronauts have a change in perspective when they're in orbit, and they look down on the Earth and they don't see borders and they don't see our tribes, and they see us all together as a crew on the spaceship Earth hurtling through the void, and how that changes their perspective completely when they come back, and that arguably was responsible for the birth of the environmental movement as we know it. So we wanted to mention that in the prompt and raise awareness around it for the kids that were participating. But we personalized it and asked them about a time they experienced a change in perspective. So they weren't essays about space. They were essays about growing up and experiencing a change in perspective. And a lot of times it did amount to an overview of some kind, and seeing the world as bigger, or seeing the unity between people. But it was really great that all these girls wrote about a change in perspective that they had. So that, there's been different prompts for different videos and different essays in the different versions of it. In France, we really focused on the environment, but making it something personalized so that it's not just the space geeks who get to play, right? Everybody's got to change their perspective. Right?
Yeah. And they did videos, which is a medium that a lot of them are used to, and that's how they communicate in today's world, through social media.
And we focused on discovery and exploration as a theme. And again, every teenager can talk about discovery and exploration in their lives. So they talked about their travel. None of them had been to space, of course. Now some of them have experienced weightlessness, but everybody could make a video about discovery and exploration.
So the pilot started in New York, and then the winners were able to get a 0G flight. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that was like? I saw some videos. Yeah.
All we did was promise a 0G flight, but in the end, we ended up having so much more. We worked with the Challenger Center right there in Manhattan, and 25 of the finalists had a simulated mission to Mars experience at the Challenger Center. The same day, actually, it went up. Their faces were on massive billboards in Times Square due to a partnership with the Female Quotient, talking about equity in space and gender equity in space. And we, the week later, we had a Yuri's Night celebration for them, on actual Yuri's Night. I think it was the 12th, right? And we sent 5 of the winners to Space Camp. Space Camp donated the tickets to their new leadership program. And then finally, we sent 5 winners on the 0G flight. And even then, through a partnership with Gaze in Space, we were able to send them up with Star Trek actor Denise Crosby. And through a partnership with 0G, our executive director, Kim Macharia, got to go up. So it's just a really stellar experience for the 5 winners, one from each borough of the city, got to go up on that flight in May, and just so above and beyond what we even set out to do. And by that point, we had the speaker series was running. We were working on the curriculum. I feel like we really over-delivered on on a contest to send 5 girls on a 0G flight. Yeah.
Well, it was the pilot. So you want to tell us what the plans are going forward for SpacePrize?
Yeah. At about the same time, we made reservations on Space Perspective, which is a balloon that will go up to the edge of the atmosphere. And it's totally different from a rocket flight. It takes 2 hours to go up. You've got 2 hours to look around, and then 2 hours to come back down and splash down in the ocean. But that won't be flying until 2025. So we're planning to launch a global competition around that in 2024. Meanwhile, we're focusing on these regional competitions. So we just did something similar to what we did in New York and Paris. We've got one going on right now in Portugal, and the girls in both those cases will win 0G flights as well. We're working on one in Israel that will also culminate in 0G flights. But then we're looking at some elsewhere. I'm really excited that we don't have funding for it. Really excited about the possibility of doing one in New Mexico near the Spaceport America. They have traditionally economically depressed education system around there. The kids are like 80% free and reduced lunch or more. And we can go in and help connect those kids to all the amazing stuff that's happening in the space industry right in their backyard. And so that might not be a 0G flight, but maybe it's getting to go to the Virgin Galactic hangar and getting able to see the missile range. And those sorts of things could happen in New Mexico. So looking at other locations in the UK and in Los Angeles, for instance, and if anybody has the right, speaking of ways people could help, we need the right partners and the right benefactors to make this happen in more communities around the planet, to go and do an attention-grabbing contest with spectacular prizes, and thus also introduce people to all of the open education resources that we have. In fact, there's some really great stuff at spaceprize.org/y that'll get into what you and I were talking about earlier. I think it's /y, with all of why space and why space matters to Earth, and all the spin-off technologies and all that business is you can find there. So that's more or less right now. We're focused on these regional competitions, finding the right benefactors and partners to make them happen, and then building up to the global one. And we've got a few things I probably shouldn't talk about on a recording on the back burner that may be very, very exciting, much faster than waiting for that competition in 2024-25. So we'll see.
And another component that these girls get when they enter into the competition is mentors. You have a mentorship program as well.
And thank you for all of your help, by the way. We didn't really get into it yet, but with judging and helping out, and mentoring the girls and all that business is just fantastic. But yes, each winner gets a full year of mentorship from a woman in the space industry. And many of them are engineers and scientists, but we also have tried to match mentors to the girls that are involved. So, for instance, the girl I was talking about earlier, Maya, who's an English and social studies enthusiast. She's actually paired with Paula Korn, who was in PR at NASA and worked for Boeing and worked for some space startups and has essentially been a writer in the space industry. And the idea that Maya could have that moment where she says, "Wait, there's a place for a writer in the space industry," and it kind of changed her whole perspective on that. And that's definitely something we're trying to provide for a lot of the participants, not just the people that go up. But yes, for the winners, there is a year of mentorship. We actually got to do the mentor match right now for Paris. We just announced the winners at IAC last week, so really excited about that next step.
Well, congratulations on that. And one of the things I want to kind of wrap that whole segment up on is how can people participate in this and go forward? How can they bring it to their area?
Yeah, thanks. So for SpacePrize, certainly anybody can go to spaceprize.org. There's a donate button. But really what we need are partners and benefactors that can help make more of these regional competitions happen. So if you are interested in bringing it to your city or your state or your country, hit us up at spaceprize.org. There's a contact form there too, or reach out to me. Just mark at spaceprize.org. The generic one is launch at spaceprize.org. And you can, you know what? It might be liftoff at spaceprize.org. It's launch at Ares, I think. But you can, if it's not one, it's the other. It's at the bottom of the page. But that's really what we're looking for right now is the connections to find the right partners and benefactors. Of course, we're also always looking for judges and mentors from across the space industry, particularly women. So if you're a woman in the space industry in whatever capacity, and you might be interested in judging a competition or mentoring the winners, then reach out.
And I'd like to actually go back a little bit and go back to the workforce. What type of jobs do you see in the next 10 to 20 years what kind of jobs do you think we will need to fill?
Well, it's interesting. You talk to the folks at Virgin, and they just need people who can weld and work with composites, and it's very similar at SpaceX, I think too. We're going to need people who can build these things, right? Because again, not everybody's going to be an engineer, but we also need engineers and scientists and you name it, lots and lots of coders. If you go look at Space Force right now, everything is computer science. So it's not just engineers. We need computer scientists at every level. You don't hit an asteroid millions of miles away, dead center like we did without some really fantastic computer scientists on the team. But aside from that, I think it's sort of a recurring theme in this conversation is we need space lawyers. Like that's obviously an expanding field right now that's behind right now, right? There's a lot of challenges ahead that we're not yet prepared for. So that's going to be exciting. And space history is just a field that's only beginning and going through primary documents from the Apollo era and that kind of thing. Never mind what's happening right now, because holy smoke, are we in an exciting time right now? And looking back on this and being able to talk about it is going to be interesting. but spacecraft interior designers, spacesuit designers, that's an industry that's blowing up right now too. Trying to think of other examples off the top of my head, but oh my goodness, yeah, hospitality. In fact, the owner of my publishing company, the company that published my book, Dylan Taylor's company, also just announced a partnership with Hilton, I believe, to build the first orbital hotel. So those kinds of, when we talk about any industry, I mean, if you're in the hospitality industry now, you might, and you're a space enthusiast, your skills may be in demand in the coming years, or at the very least, there's a possibility you could shoot for, right? But at scale, we're going to need a lot of computer scientists and engineers. At some degree, I think we're going to need pilots or whatever the equivalent is in terms of having people on board. Maybe that is a hospitality job more than anything. And space educators. We're going to need a lot of people who can turn around and teach the next generation about this. So that might be a niche I'm a little more familiar with.
Well, the next generation, this generation, and the one that's after that, because, for example, people our age, they're going to need education on what is changing and how it's affecting them. I went back to school several years ago because it had changed so much. So we have everybody's going to need education. And I would like to let the audience know about the space law needs. When we go up into space, there's questions like, who owns it? What laws do we have up there? What's proprietary? And do we have the rights to go to space debris and take an old satellite? Are there patents that are protected on that? So space law is huge on going forward on how we're going to have it structured up above the orbit.
Yeah, and we obviously have the Outer Space Treaty is well established, but as we head off in this direction with the Artemis Accords, there's other countries heading another direction, and reconciling that is going to be very, very interesting.
Very interesting to say the least. So that's a huge industry that's going to need a lot of people. So, what advice do you give teachers, STEAM programs, schools, organizations, if they want to start programs in their area? What advice do you give them?
Well, I suppose I can go back to what I said earlier about stepping off that cycle. Like, if you're interested in doing that, you need to be the one to make it happen. Because if you're looking at the people above you, it's just going to be that whole cycle. So step off that cycle and make it happen. The other advice, going back to something I heard as an educational technologist years ago, is I heard a teacher ask a question of a panelist, and the teacher said, "Well, what?" And this was, I think, using blogs and wikis and podcasts in the classroom or something. And the teacher asked, like, "What do we do if our school district doesn't let us do that?" And this guy Tom March from Australia just responded without missing a beat: "Be subversive. Like, do it anyway. Your kids need to know about this. This is their future. Give them the opportunity to learn about this stuff and create some cool projects, that solve problems in their world and in their future. And then show everybody else about it and show them how cool it was to do that. And sooner or later, you'll get the permission you need to do it formally, right? But I think do it anyway. When we're talking about space impacting every industry, and we're talking about all of the needs across, the whole economy for people to be for space literacy, right? It doesn't matter what you teach. You can build this into your program. You don't have to be a science, technology, or math teacher. You can build this into your literature class. How do the issues you're talking about in crime and punishment play out on a settlement on another planet or whatever it might be? How does Lord of the Flies apply to what might be happening on the moon in less than 10 years? So it gets there are ways you could connect, and I'm just off the top of my head there with a couple of literature examples, but I think across the curriculum we could be talking. If you're teaching biology, what better way to do it than ask kids what happens to the human body or the frog or whatever if it's in lower gravity? Like, you can build this into everything you're doing and raise that awareness, raise that space literacy across the board.
And you don't have to do it in school. There's lots of programs that happen outside of school in different buildings. For example, something near and dear is spaceports. Spaceports could have a whole educational training, space camps, that sort of thing. So it doesn't have to happen within the school structure to happen, but it needs to happen.
Yeah, the Challenger Center is a great example because those are all over in the U.S. and the really, really very cool simulators and programs that they do for really inexpensively to bring teachers in. I think it's $500 to bring a class to the Challenger Center and do a simulated mission to Mars. It's unbelievable. And I'm surprised. Yeah, I'm surprised that if you look at Virgin Galactic and Galactic Unite, and you look at Blue Origin's Club for the Future, there is a small team of people working on education issues. I'm not aware of a similar effort at SpaceX, although there was a very, very interesting internal school for SpaceX employees and Elon's kids for a while there. Josh Don spun off as Synthesis, so hat tip to him and his team. But I imagine we're in a situation, if you're talking about spaceports and space companies, I imagine we're in a situation very like the 80s when Apple put Apple IIs into classrooms everywhere. And go figure, Apple is one of the most valuable companies in the world today. Somebody's going to want the hearts and minds of kids, and maybe it's SpaceX, and maybe it's Sierra or somebody else that's coming up behind them. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. If I look at the analog in education technology, 15 years ago, there was no Google Apps for education. There was no Google Apps, barely. There were no Chromebooks. And now those things are 95%. Before COVID, 95% market penetration in the U.S. Google absolutely bowled over everybody else in that space in the classroom, Microsoft included. So somebody's going to want the hearts and minds of kids, and it's going to be interesting to see who that is. And for our part, when it comes to spaceports, we are opening the first campus of Ares here in Southern California. We can get to Hawthorne, we can get to Boeing, we can get to Edwards Air Force Base. There's lots of satellite companies right here. It's been an aerospace hotbed for decades, but the places on our short list for expansion are the places with spaceports. So New Mexico and Texas and Florida and Colorado. Colorado Springs would be a great place for a school focused on space education. So and then we can look to Adelaide and some of the places that are aspirational around the globe too.
So what message do you want to leave our audience today with? What thoughts do you want for them to walk away with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that importance of space literacy, the sort of urgent importance of preparing kids for the growing space economy, and the very real importance of preparing kids for the rapidly approaching multi-planet future of humanity. I mean, before today's kindergartners graduate, we should have a permanent presence on the moon, and we're going to have people on Mars. So we are finally knocking on the door of being a multi-planetary species, and we're not prepared for that when it comes to our education systems. So I think the reality of that, if is something I would hope our audience would not only take away, because we may be preaching to the choir a little bit in that respect, but pass on. Like it's up to everybody who's listening to a podcast like this to turn around and pass it on. Share this episode with your friends and colleagues who are not into space and who are not space enthusiasts, and spread the word of what's happening, I guess.
And the last little bit, how do people contact you? How can they work with you? How do you want them to interact with you?
Thanks. I'm super easy to find. If you just search for Mark Wagner in Ares or Mark Wagner in space, you'll find me, or Mark Wagner in education technology for that matter. But I'm twitter.com/Mark Wagner. At Facebook, it's and LinkedIn, it's Mark Douglas Wagner. Almost everywhere else, I'm Mark D. Wagner at gmail.com, for instance. So you can find me all over the internet, and would love to connect with you and love to work with you on any of these projects, whether it's Aries or SpacePrize or the Overview Roundtable, the Human Space Program. There's really a lot of opportunity to get involved, no matter who you are or what industry you're in, because it's going to impact you and you can be a part of it.
Well, there are so many changes on the horizon and above it. Every industry will be affected, and education is one of them. So thank you, Dr. Wagner, for sharing this exciting new version of what education can and should be. And thank you to all of the teachers out there who work hard to educate and inspire the next generation. You have an important role in our lives. So happy World Teacher Day. And look for Mark's book, available on Amazon, and that title again is Space Education, Preparing Students for Humanity's Multi-Planet Future. Please subscribe before you head on over to my YouTube channel for bonus footage. Links to the YouTube channel and other social media channels can be found on spacemarketingpodcast.com. A special thanks to Dr. Wagner for joining us today and sharing his new book, Space Education, his efforts on SpacePrize, and the Aries educational program with us as he strives to inspire the next generation in their journey to space. Be sure to check out their links listed in today's show notes. I hope that you have found this podcast useful for your journey as you reach for the stars.